On a crisp autumn morning in 1985, Eleanor Lancaster was born into a life most would envy. The only child of Charles and Margaret Lancaster, she grew up in the affluent enclave of Larchmont, New York, surrounded by manicured lawns, historic mansions, and the quiet hum of old money. To outsiders, the Lancasters epitomized perfection: Charles, a prominent attorney with a sharp mind and an unshakable demeanor, and Margaret, a celebrated artist whose works graced galleries from New York to Paris. Yet, behind the imposing walls of their colonial estate, perfection came at a cost. Eleanor's childhood was a carefully orchestrated symphony of high expectations. Charles, ever the pragmatist, envisioned his daughter excelling in academics, mastering diplomacy, and one day carrying on the family's illustrious reputation. Margaret, on the other hand, saw Eleanor as her muse, a vessel to channel her artistic dreams and perhaps rectify her own choices. These conflicting ideals left Eleanor walking a tightrope, balancing between the two worlds while struggling to find her own. As a child, Eleanor quickly learned that love in the Lancaster household was conditional, measured in accomplishments and accolades. Her days were filled with piano lessons, etiquette classes, and academic pursuits, all monitored by her father's stern gaze. Even moments of levity, like finger painting in Margaret's sun-drenched studio, came with critiques on composition and color theory. "You're talented, Ellie," her mother would say, dabbing at her own canvas, "but you must channel your emotions with precision. Art without discipline is chaos." By the time Eleanor entered the prestigious Chatsworth Academy, she had become a model of grace and intellect. Teachers marveled at her quick wit and magnetic charm, while peers admired her poise. She excelled in debate club, outshone her classmates in history, and stole the spotlight in school plays. Yet beneath the polished exterior was a girl who never felt quite enough. The weight of her family's name and the silent comparisons to her parents pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible shroud. Eleanor's teenage years brought moments of quiet rebellion, though even these were tempered by her need for validation. While other students snuck off to parties, Eleanor poured herself into crafting speeches that would make her father proud or sketches that might earn a rare approving nod from her mother. Her most significant act of defiance was applying to the New York School of Fine Arts against her father's wishes. When Charles discovered her acceptance letter, his fury was swift. "Art is not a career," he barked, crumpling the letter in his fist. "It's a hobby, Eleanor. A distraction. You're meant for greater things." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but she held her ground. "I want to create, Dad. I want something that's mine." Her defiance was short-lived. Under the pressure of Charles's relentless reasoning, she conceded, enrolling instead at Columbia University to study business and political science. Though she excelled academically, a quiet part of her yearned for the life she had briefly glimpsed, the one filled with color and creation rather than contracts and expectations. By the time Eleanor graduated with honors, she was the perfect Lancaster daughter, poised, accomplished, and wholly uncertain of who she truly was. What no one could have foreseen was that this unresolved battle for identity would shape the course of her life in ways no one, not even Eleanor, could predict. It was a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to unravel the perfect life she had meticulously constructed. It was the winter of 2010 when Eleanor Lancaster first met Nathaniel "Nate" Cooper. The setting was nothing short of cinematic, a bustling art gallery in Manhattan, with champagne glasses clinking softly against the murmur of the city's elite. Eleanor, now in her mid-20s and managing a promising career in the art world, was hosting the event. Her presence was magnetic, commanding attention with effortless charm as she navigated conversations about contemporary masterpieces. Yet, it was during one of those fleeting moments, as she stood alone admiring a newly unveiled sculpture, that she felt a presence beside her. "Impressive, isn't it?" a smooth voice interrupted her thoughts. Turning, Eleanor was met with the confident gaze of Nate Cooper, a man with sharp features and an air of effortless sophistication. His tailored suit fit him like a second skin, and his smile was disarming. There was an ease about him, as though he belonged wherever he stood. "Indeed," she replied, her voice steady despite the slight flutter in her chest. "Though I suspect the story behind it might be even more captivating." Nate chuckled, a warm, rich sound that made Eleanor feel like the only person in the room. "Perhaps you could tell me that story sometime," he said, raising his glass to her. Their connection was immediate, and within weeks, Nate was a constant figure in Eleanor's life. He was 7 years her senior, already a rising star in the world of finance, with a reputation for charm and strategic brilliance. His polished manners and boyish confidence were a stark contrast to the reserved, calculated men Eleanor had grown up around. He introduced her to the finer points of wine tasting and the exhilarating freedom of sailing, while she opened his eyes to the nuances of modern art and the joys of spontaneity. To Eleanor, Nate felt like a breath of fresh air, a reprieve from the stifling expectations of her upbringing. By the spring of 2011, Nate proposed during a romantic getaway to Martha's Vineyard. The proposal was as perfect as their whirlwind romance, a private dinner under a canopy of stars, with Nate down on one knee, presenting a diamond ring that sparkled like their future seemed to. Overwhelmed with emotion, Eleanor said yes without hesitation. Their wedding was a lavish affair held at a sprawling estate in the Hamptons, attended by New York's most influential figures. Margaret Lancaster beamed with pride, while Charles offered his silent approval, a rare gesture that Eleanor clung to as proof that she had made the right choice. The early years of their marriage were like a dream. They moved into a luxurious penthouse in Tribeca, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering sweeping views of Manhattan's skyline. Their life together was a montage of glamorous parties, exotic vacations, and professional triumphs. Eleanor thrived in her role as a curator at a prominent gallery, while Nate's career in finance skyrocketed. To the outside world, they were the epitome of success, a golden couple with everything at their fingertips. But beneath the shimmering surface, cracks began to form. Nate's work hours grew longer, his business trips more frequent. Eleanor, who had once felt so alive in his presence, now found herself dining alone in their cavernous apartment, her only company the quiet hum of the city below. At first, she brushed off her unease as a normal adjustment to marriage. Yet as the months turned into years, an invisible wall seemed to grow between them. Eleanor attempted to bridge the gap, planning romantic weekends and trying to engage Nate in meaningful conversations. But his responses were always the same, distracted, vague reassurances that he was just busy. "We're doing fine, Ellie," he'd say, barely looking up from his phone. "You're overthinking it." She wasn't overthinking it. By their 5th anniversary, Eleanor couldn't ignore the growing void. The passion that had once defined their relationship had dimmed, replaced by polite exchanges that felt more like transactions than conversations. At parties, they played their roles flawlessly, smiling for cameras and exchanging pleasantries with colleagues. But behind closed doors, they were strangers, each retreating into their own silent world. The turning point came in the winter of 2016. One evening, after Nate had returned late from yet another business trip, Eleanor decided to confront him. Her voice trembled as she voiced her fears, laying bare the loneliness and doubts that had consumed her. She half expected him to fight for their marriage, to reassure her that they could rebuild what they'd lost. Instead, Nate sighed, his expression a mix of resignation and relief. "You're not wrong, Ellie," he admitted quietly. Maybe we've just grown apart." His words shattered something inside her. For all her suspicions, she hadn't expected him to surrender so easily. But as the conversation unfolded, it became clear that Nate, too, had been contemplating an exit. He spoke of their different paths, of how they had become more like partners in a business than lovers. It was a painful yet strangely amicable discussion, one that ended with both of them agreeing to part ways. The divorce was finalized by the spring of 2016, with Nate ensuring that Eleanor was financially secure and allowed to keep their Tribeca loft. To friends and family, the separation was a shock. How could the perfect couple have failed? But to Eleanor, it felt like both a relief and a failure. She mourned not just the end of her marriage but the idealized version of love she had clung to for so long. What Eleanor didn't realize was that this was only the beginning. The end of her marriage to Nate would set off a chain of events that would unravel her life in ways she could never have anticipated. In the wake of her divorce, Eleanor Lancaster found herself standing at a crossroads, the weight of her past marriage pulling at her like an anchor. For the first time in her life, she was alone, not in the sense of being abandoned, but in the profound realization that the future she had envisioned for herself was no longer there. She had once been the golden child of her family, always striving to meet expectations, but now, in the quiet aftermath of her broken marriage, Eleanor was left with nothing but the echo of her own thoughts. The carefully constructed facade of her life had come crashing down, leaving her to sift through the wreckage and decide what came next. The decision to embark on a journey of self-discovery wasn't made overnight. For months, Eleanor struggled with feelings of inadequacy and loss. The world that once seemed so certain had been turned upside down. It wasn't until she found herself standing in the living room of their Tribeca penthouse, staring out at the New York City skyline, that she made the choice: she would leave. Not because Nate had abandoned her, but because, for the first time, she had the opportunity to find out who she truly was without the weight of other people's expectations. By the summer of 2016, Eleanor had sold their penthouse and packed away the remnants of her marriage. With no set destination in mind, she booked a flight to Santa Fe, New Mexico, seeking solace in the quiet, vast desert landscape. The desert was an odd choice for someone like Eleanor, someone who had lived her entire life in bustling, fast-paced cities, where social status and appearances mattered. Yet, there was something about the solitude of Santa Fe that called to her. The expansive skies and endless stretches of sand offered her the space she needed to breathe, to think, and most importantly, to begin again. Eleanor spent her days wandering the art galleries that lined the historic streets, letting the vibrant colors and textured brushstrokes speak to her in ways she hadn't experienced before. She was drawn to the works of local artists, whose creations were raw and unrefined, yet full of life. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to feel. She would sit in the galleries for hours, losing track of time as she observed the paintings and sculptures, finding herself in the stories they told. She began to sketch again, something she had abandoned during her years with Nate. But this time, her art was different. It wasn't about impressing anyone or meeting expectations. It was simply about expressing herself. After a few weeks in Santa Fe, Eleanor felt a stirring deep within her. It was as if a part of her that had been dormant for years had suddenly come to life. She had always been a perfectionist, driven by the need to meet her parents' lofty expectations, to live up to the image of success they had carved out for her. But now, with the weight of their demands lifted, she was free to explore who she really was. She found a small art studio and began working on her own paintings, pushing herself to embrace the raw emotion she had long buried. She created abstract pieces, playing with shapes and colors that reflected the turmoil and the beauty she had discovered within herself. But as much as Santa Fe had given her the space to heal, Eleanor knew that the journey of self-discovery couldn't end there. She craved more. And so, by the fall of 2016, she booked a flight to Kyoto, Japan, another place that promised solitude but in a different way. Kyoto was steeped in tradition, its ancient temples and serene gardens offering a stark contrast to the chaotic streets of New York. Eleanor immersed herself in the quiet rhythm of the city. Each morning, she would rise early to visit the Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, and sit in stillness, meditating on the reflections in the tranquil pond before her. The experience was grounding, calming, and profoundly transformative. It reminded her that peace didn't come from external achievements, but from within. Her time in Kyoto was filled with moments of introspection, where she could finally hear her own voice without the constant hum of the outside world. She visited Zen gardens and meditated for hours, letting the silence wash over her. Slowly, she began to dismantle the rigid expectations she had imposed on herself for so long. She had spent her entire life trying to mold herself into something others would approve of, but now, she realized that true freedom came from letting go of that image entirely. By the time Eleanor arrived in the Scottish Highlands, she was a different person, calmer, more centered, and more open to the possibilities of life. The rugged beauty of the Highlands seemed to mirror the rawness Eleanor had come to embrace in herself. She hiked through the hills, the wind whipping through her hair, and felt a sense of liberation she had never known. The isolation of the Highlands allowed her to be truly alone, yet never lonely. There, amidst the towering cliffs and vast lochs, she confronted the deepest parts of herself, the parts she had kept hidden for so long. It was here, in the remote beauty of Scotland, that Eleanor truly began to understand the depth of her own soul. She wasn't defined by her parents' expectations, by the failures of her marriage, or by the social status that had once consumed her. She was her own person, with her own desires and dreams, and she had the power to shape her future however she saw fit. When Eleanor returned to New York in early 2017, she felt like a new person. She wasn't the same woman who had left the city a year ago. Her time in Santa Fe, Kyoto, and the Highlands had given her the space and perspective she needed to reclaim her identity. She wasn't just Eleanor Lancaster, the daughter of Charles and Margaret. She was Eleanor Lancaster, an artist in her own right, a woman who had faced her demons and emerged stronger. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. Eleanor's next chapter was one of her own making, a fresh start, filled with new possibilities. She sold the last remnants of her old life and opened a small art gallery in the heart of Brooklyn, one that showcased her own work alongside pieces from other emerging artists. She had found a new sense of purpose and joy, one that was not dependent on anyone else's approval but her own. The woman who had once sought validation from her family, from her ex-husband, and from society, had finally learned to validate herself. But as much as she had healed, Eleanor knew that life was full of unexpected turns. And little did she know that her journey of self-discovery would soon lead her to a new chapter, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and betrayal. It was at a gala for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2017 when Eleanor Lancaster first laid eyes on Andrew "Drew" Harrington. The night was glittering with the usual crowd of New York's elite, but this time, Eleanor felt different. She had shed the remnants of her past, and for the first time in years, she was genuinely herself. The city, the art, the people, everything felt new, fresh, and alive. As she floated from one conversation to another, offering her thoughts on contemporary art and the museum's latest acquisition, she noticed a man standing off to the side, his gaze fixed on a painting, not with the detached air of the typical New York socialite, but with genuine curiosity. Drew was a professor of literature, dressed in a classic black tuxedo that, unlike the more ostentatious outfit surrounding him, seemed understated but impeccable. There was an intensity to him, a quiet confidence that immediately drew Eleanor in. His presence was different from the flashy businessmen she had encountered in her past. He exuded a warmth and depth that felt foreign, yet incredibly appealing. Unable to resist, Eleanor approached him. "What's your take on this piece?" she asked, gesturing toward the painting in front of them. He glanced at her, his eyes bright with intellectual curiosity. "I see the tension between chaos and order," Drew said, his voice calm, measured. "It's like the artist captured the balance between creation and destruction, don't you think?" Eleanor was taken aback. Here was someone who saw art the way she did, through a lens of deeper meaning. Their conversation quickly morphed from art to philosophy, to poetry, and to the intricacies of life itself. With Drew, she felt understood in a way that she hadn't with anyone else. There was no facade, no pretension, just a genuine exchange of thoughts and ideas. Over the following months, Drew and Eleanor began to spend more time together, their connection growing deeper with each passing day. He was different from Nate. There was no rush, no extravagant gestures, just an easy, natural flow between them. Drew encouraged her to embrace her creative side even more, taking long walks through Central Park, discussing books, and sharing poetry under the stars. Eleanor, in turn, shared her passion for contemporary art with him, taking him to galleries and introducing him to the world she had once felt confined by. With him, she felt no pressure to be perfect, no need to fit into the mold that had defined so much of her life. Their relationship progressed quickly, and by the fall of 2018, they were inseparable. Drew proposed on a crisp autumn evening in Central Park, presenting her with a vintage emerald ring, one that had belonged to his grandmother. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect. It was simple, meaningful, and symbolic of the life they were about to build together. Eleanor said yes without hesitation. The proposal had been intimate, surrounded only by the vibrant fall foliage and the soft sounds of the city. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt that this was where she belonged, no longer trying to meet expectations or live up to a standard set by her parents. With Drew, she could be her true self. Their wedding, a quiet affair at the New York Public Library, was the embodiment of their relationship, unpretentious, sincere, and deeply personal. Only close friends and family were invited, and the ceremony took place in the Rose main reading room, beneath the grand ceiling, surrounded by books and the quiet hum of history. Eleanor stood there, beside Drew, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace and certainty. This was her life now, not one defined by the past but one she had chosen for herself. The first year of marriage felt like a dream. They settled into a charming brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn, a far cry from the grandeur of the Tribeca penthouse Eleanor had once shared with Nate. There, in their cozy apartment, they built a life that was intimate and fulfilling. Weekends were spent exploring the city's hidden gems, attending literary events, and hosting small dinner parties for their eclectic group of friends. Eleanor's gallery, which she had reopened, flourished under her renewed passion, while Drew received a prestigious grant to write a book on the intersection of visual arts and 20th-century literature. For the first time, Eleanor felt like she was living the life she had always longed for, one where work and passion were no longer separate, but intertwined in a way that gave her both fulfillment and joy. They supported each other's dreams wholeheartedly, creating a partnership that felt like the ideal of modern marriage, mutually enriching, deeply connected, and completely in sync. However, as time passed, the inevitable tension of life began to creep in. Drew, now immersed in his book project, began to spend more and more time in his study, buried in his research and writing. Eleanor, while supportive of his work, couldn't help but feel the stirrings of something familiar, an unsettling sense of distance. The initial spark between them, which had burned so brightly in the early days, began to flicker, and Eleanor started to sense a growing divide. She tried to push away the feeling, choosing instead to focus on the positives. After all, Drew was still present in the ways that mattered, their late-night discussions over dinner, the morning spent together before he went off to work. But as their second anniversary approached, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Drew's once inviting demeanor had shifted, and the spark that had drawn her to him seemed to be dimming. One evening, Eleanor sat in their living room, watching Drew as he absently scrolled through his phone. His face, once so open and warm, was now closed off, preoccupied, distant. Something had changed, and Eleanor felt it in the pit of her stomach. She told herself to be patient, that it was just the stress of his work, but deep down, she couldn't ignore the growing discomfort. Then, things began to unravel in ways she had never imagined. Drew mentioned a new research partner, a fellow professor named Julian, with whom he'd been working closely. Yet, despite his enthusiasm, he was strangely evasive about introducing Eleanor to Julian. When she pressed him, his responses were vague, his reluctance noticeable. The more Eleanor tried to convince herself that she was overthinking it, the more her suspicions grew. She began to notice small inconsistencies in Drew's behavior, his late nights at the office, his secretive phone calls, and his increasingly distant demeanor. But she refused to let herself confront the fear that lingered in the back of her mind. She had been down this road before, and she wasn't ready to face the possibility that the life she had built with Drew might be just as fragile as the one she had left behind with Nate. But little did she know, this time, the betrayal would be far more shocking than she could ever imagine. As their second anniversary approached, Eleanor was standing on the edge of a precipice, caught between the comfort of what she thought was a perfect marriage and the gnawing suspicion that her worst fears might be coming true. The question that haunted her now was, how long could she ignore the truth? It started with small, unnoticeable details, those subtle cracks in the facade of Eleanor's seemingly perfect marriage. She had tried to brush them aside, telling herself she was being paranoid, that her mind was playing tricks on her. Drew had been consumed with his book for months now, his work more demanding than ever, and she had been understanding, giving him the space he needed. But the growing distance between them felt suffocating. What began as a minor discomfort soon became an undeniable ache. It was late one evening in the spring of 2023 when Eleanor noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. Drew, as usual, had retreated into his study, leaving Eleanor alone in their cozy living room. She was sitting by the window, reading, when she overheard him on the phone. The conversation was muffled, but she could hear the tone of his voice, a whisper, urgent, and filled with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. Her curiosity piqued, Eleanor tried to focus on her book, but the nagging voice in the back of her head wouldn't let her go. She stood up, moved quietly toward the door of the study, and paused just outside, listening. Drew's words were unintelligible, but the moment he ended the call, Eleanor heard him say, "I'll see you soon," and then a soft laugh, a laugh that was too familiar, too intimate. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She knew that laugh. It was the same laugh that had once been shared between Nate and herself in the early days of their marriage. That same easy, carefree sound that came only when two people shared a private joke or connection. But this time, it wasn't her sharing that laugh with Drew, it was someone else. Someone she didn't know. Her pulse quickened as a sense of dread crept up her spine. Eleanor had never been the type to snoop, but now, she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong. The voice inside her told her she had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next morning, as Drew left for what he claimed was another writing session at the university, Eleanor couldn't hold back any longer. She felt as if she were walking through a fog, torn between guilt and determination, but ultimately, driven by the need to uncover the truth. She went straight to his study, where his phone was charging on the desk. With trembling hands, she picked it up and unlocked it, her heart hammering in her chest. What she found was a series of texts, many of them cryptic, but unmistakably intimate. Drew had been exchanging messages with someone he referred to as Jay, and the tone was far more than professional. Her fingers shook as she scrolled, reading exchanges that sent shockwaves through her. There were messages about late-night research sessions, the way he felt when they were together, and, disturbingly, a few messages hinting at something more than academic camaraderie, lines about being together again soon, and "I miss you." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. Drew was having an affair. But what truly stunned her, what made the room spin and the ground beneath her seem to drop away, was that the person he was seeing was none other than Julian, the very same professor he had mentioned several times, the colleague he had been so secretive about introducing to her. Her mind raced. She had seen the signs, hadn't she? The late nights, the veiled excuses, the strange energy between them. But she had brushed them off as the stresses of work, things that were so easy to dismiss when she didn't want to believe that the man she had married, the man she had trusted with her heart, was capable of betrayal. But now, there was no denying it. Drew's affair wasn't just a mistake, it was a calculated deceit, a betrayal that had been happening right under her nose. The phone dropped from her hands as if it were a burning coal. Eleanor staggered back, her knees buckling beneath her. She collapsed onto the sofa, trying to process the sheer weight of what she had uncovered. The emotions hit her in waves, shock, disbelief, anger, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. How could he? How could Drew, the man who had been so tender with her, who had seen her for who she truly was, do this to her? For a moment, Eleanor was paralyzed, trapped in the suffocating realization that everything she thought she knew about her marriage was a lie. She felt as though the ground beneath her had given way, that the life she had so carefully built was crumbling around her. But beneath the anger, beneath the pain, there was something else, a cold clarity. The woman who had once been too afraid to confront her past, too afraid to face the truth, was no longer hiding. She wasn't going to let this slide, wasn't going to let Drew's betrayal define her. The tears came then, hot and uncontrolled, but even as they flowed, Eleanor knew what she had to do. She had to confront him. She had to face him and hear the words he would say to justify this. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain, she couldn't live in a lie anymore. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone and typed a simple message, "We need to talk. Now." As soon as she hit send, she felt a sense of finality settle in. There would be no going back after this moment. She had uncovered the truth, and now she had to face the consequences of knowing it. Little did she know, the confrontation would come sooner than she expected, and the truth would tear apart everything she thought she understood about love, trust, and the capacity for betrayal. The days that followed Eleanor's discovery of Drew's betrayal were a blur of anger, confusion, and pain. Each time she looked at him, the man who had once made her feel safe, loved, and understood, she felt as though she were staring at a stranger. The warmth in his eyes, the easy smiles they had once shared, now felt like cruel imitations of a life that no longer existed. Each interaction, each word he spoke, felt like a stab to her heart, reminding her of the lie he had built their relationship on. Drew, oblivious to the storm raging inside her, continued his routine as if nothing had changed. He came home late from work, ate his dinner in front of the TV, and went to bed early, burying himself in his research. But Eleanor could no longer ignore the truth. The man she had loved and trusted had betrayed her in the most intimate way possible. And in the silence that had settled between them, Eleanor felt an overwhelming need to confront him, not just to seek answers, but to make him feel the weight of his actions. But confronting him wasn't enough. No, this betrayal, this lie, had to be paid for in a way that would forever change the course of both their lives. The night was dark and heavy with anticipation as Eleanor sat in their living room, her mind whirling with the implications of what she had discovered. Drew had promised to meet her after his meeting with Julian, but for now, he was still unaware that she knew everything. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Eleanor sat by the window, her fingers absently tracing the edge of a glass. Her thoughts raced. She had tried to reason with herself, to tell herself that revenge would only make her more like the people she hated, the people who thrived on chaos and destruction. But the rage, the deep, gut-wrenching hurt she felt from his betrayal, overshadowed everything. It wasn't just about infidelity, it was about the years of trust, the promises, the dreams they had built together. It was about the complete dismantling of everything she had believed in. And in that moment, Eleanor realized that she wanted him to feel the same devastation she felt. She wanted him to know that his actions would cost him everything. She couldn't just sit idly by while he destroyed the life they had made together. No, Eleanor needed to make him understand what it felt like to have everything ripped away. When Drew finally came home that evening, he was unaware of the storm that had been brewing in Eleanor's mind. He walked in, dropped his briefcase by the door, and began to talk about the progress he had made with his book. He was oblivious to the way Eleanor watched him, her gaze sharp, cold. For a moment, the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin was no longer there. In her place stood a woman filled with rage and a thirst for justice, a thirst that had been awakened by his betrayal. "Is everything okay?" Drew asked, his voice more casual than it had been in days. Eleanor said nothing at first, her silence weighing heavily between them. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke, her voice low but steady. "You don't have to pretend anymore, Drew. I know." Drew's eyes flickered with confusion, but it only lasted a moment before realization washed over him. The color drained from his face. What do you mean, Eleanor? I know about you and Julian, she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. I know everything. All of it. The words hung in the air like an oppressive storm cloud, and for the first time, Drew was speechless. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His expression was one of disbelief, as though he couldn't believe she had discovered his secret. You thought you could hide it from me, didn't you? Eleanor continued, her voice a mixture of bitterness and hurt. All those late nights, the messages, the lies. You thought I wouldn't see it, wouldn't figure it out. Well, I did. Drew took a step toward her, his eyes pleading. Eleanor, please. I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't want to hurt you. But his words fell flat, like empty promises. Eleanor's gaze hardened, and for the first time in years, she felt an undeniable shift within herself. The hurt, the confusion, all of it melted away into something more powerful, an overwhelming need for retribution. You think I care about your excuses? Eleanor spat, rising from her seat. I don't need your apologies, Drew. I don't need your pity. What I need is for you to understand how much you've destroyed. How much you've taken from me. She paused, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her words. Her mind was a whirlwind, spinning out of control. The image of Drew and Julian together, the lies, the deceit, flashed before her eyes. The anger she had pushed down for so long erupted in a torrent. I'm done with you, she said coldly, stepping toward him. I'm done pretending that we're happy. That we're fine. This marriage is over. Drew reached out to grab her arm, but she pulled away, the finality in her voice clear. No. You don't get to touch me. Not after everything. As the tension between them grew unbearable, Eleanor moved to the bookshelf in the corner of the room, her hand trembling as she grasped the small revolver that had once belonged to Drew's father. The weight of it in her palm felt strange, foreign. But at the same time, it gave her a sense of control. Drew's eyes widened in shock, fear flashing across his face. What are you doing, Eleanor? He asked, his voice trembling now. The power shifted entirely, the dynamic between them changing in an instant. She was no longer the woman begging for love, begging for understanding. She was no longer the one willing to put up with betrayal. She was in control. With shaking hands, Eleanor raised the gun, her mind clouded with a mixture of fury and sorrow. You've broken me, Drew. And now it's time for you to understand what it feels like. The first shot rang out, a deafening noise that shattered the silence of the room. Drew stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He gasped for air, his hands clutching at his chest as he fell to the ground. Eleanor stood frozen, staring at him, unable to move. The second shot followed quickly, echoing in the stillness of the apartment. And as the smoke cleared, the weight of what she had just done settled over her like a dark cloud. Her mind raced, but it was too late. She had crossed a line that could never be undone. Her world, the one she had spent years trying to build, had crumbled in an instant. The finality of her actions hit her all at once, leaving her standing in the aftermath of destruction. She looked down at Drew's lifeless body, the blood staining the pristine white carpet, and realized that nothing would ever be the same again. As the sirens wailed in the distance, Eleanor sank to her knees, her body trembling. She had done the unthinkable, and now she would have to face the consequences. But for now, in that fleeting moment of silence, Eleanor felt a perverse sense of release. She had exacted her revenge. But the cost was far higher than she had ever imagined. The silence in the room was deafening. The sharp, metallic scent of gunpowder still lingered in the air, a stark reminder of what had just transpired. Eleanor stood frozen, her hands trembling as she slowly lowered the revolver. Her mind was in a fog, the weight of what she had done sinking in with brutal clarity. The image of Drew lying on the floor, his body crumpled and motionless, flashed before her eyes, and the reality of the moment crashed down on her like a tidal wave. She had crossed a line from which there would be no return. For what felt like an eternity, Eleanor remained where she stood, her eyes locked on Drew's lifeless form. The finality of her actions was suffocating. In that split second, she had shattered everything, the life she had built, the love she thought she had found, and the future she had imagined. But as the seconds stretched on, a deep, primal sense of dread began to claw at her chest. She had done something irreversible, and now she had to face the consequences. The first sound that broke the stillness was the distant wail of sirens, growing louder with each passing second. The police were on their way. For a brief moment, Eleanor considered running, escaping to somewhere far away where none of this would matter. But the cold, undeniable truth settled into her bones: she couldn't escape this. Not anymore. With a steadying breath, Eleanor turned away from the scene and walked to the door. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and every step felt heavier than the last. The calmness of her actions, her decision to confront Drew, her deliberate movements as she fired the shots, now seemed like a distant memory, drowned out by the overwhelming weight of what she had just done. She sat on the sofa, her hands clasped tightly together, waiting. Her mind was clouded with confusion, with regret, with anger, but it was too late to undo what had happened. She didn't know how long she sat there, staring at the walls of their apartment, before she heard the doorbell. The sound was like a final toll of a bell, signaling the end of everything she had known. When the door opened, it wasn't Drew who stood before her, it was two uniformed officers, their expressions unreadable. Their presence in the doorway felt surreal, as though it were happening to someone else. But their faces showed no hint of surprise, no shock, only the cold, professional detachment that was reserved for moments like this. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice calm but firm. "We've received a report of gunshots. May we come in?" Eleanor nodded wordlessly, her chest tightening as she stood up to let them in. The officers stepped into the room, their eyes scanning the apartment, noting the open window, the overturned furniture, and the blood-stained carpet where Drew's body lay. One of the officers approached Eleanor, his gaze piercing, as if assessing her every movement. The other knelt beside Drew, checking for any sign of life. "He's dead," the second officer said matter-of-factly. The first officer turned to Eleanor, his voice softening slightly. "Can you tell us what happened here?" he asked, but his tone carried an underlying sharpness that made it clear this wasn't a question, it was a command. Eleanor swallowed hard. Her mouth was dry, and for the first time, she felt truly exposed. She had rehearsed what she would say, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt hollow, rehearsed. The gravity of her actions bore down on her, and she struggled to summon the courage to speak. I don't know what happened," she stammered, her voice shaky. He betrayed me. I found out about the affair, with Julian." Her words were halting, fragmented. She wanted to explain, wanted them to understand the depth of the pain she had felt, but it was useless. The officer's expressions were unreadable, and in the pit of her stomach, she knew that nothing she said would matter now. The truth was irrelevant. The damage had already been done. One of the officers made a note on his pad, then looked at her again. "Can you explain what happened just before we arrived?" Eleanor hesitated, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She couldn't deny what had happened, she couldn't erase the image of Drew's blood staining the carpet. She didn't know how to explain the storm that had torn through her when she discovered the truth, the rage that had boiled over and consumed her in an instant. But even as she tried to find the words, the officer's next question sent a chill down her spine. "Where is the weapon, ma'am?" Eleanor glanced at the revolver, still lying on the floor near Drew's body. She felt a coldness wash over her as she slowly turned her gaze back to the officers. It's in the room," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The officers exchanged a glance before the first one stepped into the next room to retrieve the weapon. He returned moments later, holding the gun in a plastic evidence bag. "You'll need to come with us," the officer said, his voice devoid of sympathy. Eleanor nodded numbly, as if she were no longer fully aware of what was happening. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her, and followed the officers to the door. As they escorted her out of the apartment, Eleanor felt the full weight of her actions pressing down on her. The luxury of their brownstone, the life they had built together, all of it seemed so distant now. All that was left was a sense of numbness, the knowledge that this was the beginning of something irreversible. The ride to the precinct was a blur of flashing lights and sterile silence. Eleanor couldn't bring herself to look at the officers, nor could she look out the window. Her mind raced, her heart beating erratically in her chest. She had made a choice. She had taken control of her fate in a way that would change everything, and now she would have to face the consequences. When they arrived at the precinct, Eleanor was placed in an interrogation room, the cold metal chair beneath her making her feel small, insignificant. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting harsh shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls, closing in on her. As the door opened, a seasoned detective entered, her name tag reading Detective Samuels. She was older than the officers who had brought Eleanor in, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her voice was calm, measured, but it carried the weight of experience. "Ms. Lancaster," she said, her tone steady. "We need to talk about what happened tonight." Eleanor sat silently, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She knew that this conversation, this moment, would determine everything. There would be no turning back. And though the walls of the room seemed to close in on her, she felt an odd sense of release. She had made her choice. Now, the truth would unfold, and she would have to face whatever came next. The investigation had begun. The weeks following Eleanor's arrest were a blur of emotions, anger, fear, regret, and a deep sense of loss. She was taken to the city's detention center, her world collapsing around her as the full weight of her actions settled in. She had spent years building her life, striving for perfection, and now, in one moment of blind rage, she had destroyed everything. The glamorous life she had once lived, the image of the woman she had worked so hard to become, had been shattered. Her lawyers quickly set to work, attempting to craft a defense that would paint her as a woman driven to madness by the overwhelming betrayal she had experienced. They pushed for a plea of temporary insanity, citing her emotional distress after discovering Drew's affair with Julian. Eleanor, however, felt the weight of her guilt more than she could ever express. She was beyond the need for justification, beyond the desire for sympathy. She knew what she had done. And the guilt gnawed at her every moment. The media quickly caught wind of the case. As one of New York's elite, Eleanor's name was plastered across headlines. There was shock, disbelief, and a growing curiosity about the events that led to the shooting. The public's opinion was divided. Some saw her as a woman wronged, a victim pushed too far by the cruelty of those she trusted most. Others viewed her as a cold-blooded killer, a woman scorned and driven by jealousy and vengeance. The courtroom became the stage for a high-profile drama that captivated the city. As the trial date approached, Eleanor's once glamorous image became a distant memory. She was no longer the poised, accomplished woman who had walked the halls of New York's elite galleries. Now, she was a woman accused of 2 counts of murder, facing a legal battle that would determine the rest of her life. Her lawyers worked tirelessly to present her as a victim of extreme emotional distress, someone who had been unable to control her impulses after discovering her husband's affair. The defense team argued that Eleanor's actions had been an outburst fueled by months of emotional strain, and that her emotional and psychological state at the time of the shooting left her temporarily incapable of understanding the consequences of her actions. The prosecution, however, painted a very different picture. They argued that Eleanor's actions were premeditated, that she had planned the shooting after carefully deliberating over the affair. The prosecution highlighted her careful acquisition of the weapon, her calm demeanor before the shooting, and the fact that she had specifically sought Drew out that night to confront him. They portrayed Eleanor as a woman who had been deeply affected by the betrayal, but whose actions were driven by a desire for revenge rather than a moment of temporary insanity. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed with spectators eager to witness the unfolding drama. The gallery was full of former friends, colleagues, and acquaintances of Eleanor, all of them wondering how the woman they once knew had ended up here, on trial for her life. Eleanor sat quietly at the defense table, her face a mask of composed sorrow, her once vibrant eyes now dull with the weight of her own guilt. She avoided eye contact with anyone, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mind lost in a haze of regret. The first day of testimony was grueling for Eleanor. Her lawyers called expert witnesses, psychiatric professionals who testified that Eleanor had suffered from extreme emotional distress at the time of the shooting. They painted a picture of a woman whose entire world had crumbled, whose sense of self had been shattered by Drew's betrayal. The defense emphasized Eleanor's past, her upbringing, her need for perfection, and her struggle to maintain a facade of happiness. They argued that when Eleanor discovered the affair, she snapped, unable to cope with the devastating truth. The prosecution, in contrast, focused on Eleanor's actions in the days leading up to the shooting. They presented evidence that Eleanor had tracked Drew's movements, reading his text messages, following him to his meetings, and watching his every move. They argued that the murder was not a spur-of-the-moment act, but a calculated decision, one that Eleanor had planned meticulously. They pointed to the fact that she had known about the affair for days before she confronted Drew, that she had taken the gun from his desk and brought it to their apartment with the intention of using it. As the trial progressed, Eleanor's own testimony was the most pivotal moment. She took the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted the events of that fateful night. She spoke of the crushing betrayal she had felt, of the moment she had discovered the texts between Drew and Julian, and the overwhelming wave of rage that had consumed her. She spoke of her marriage, of her idealized vision of love and partnership, and how that vision had been shattered by Drew's infidelity. Eleanor's testimony was raw and emotional, but there was no denying the cold reality of her actions. "I was broken," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "I didn't know what else to do. I had given him everything, and he threw it away. I couldn't breathe anymore. I couldn't think. I didn't even know what I was doing." The jury listened intently, and the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Eleanor's words were heartbreaking, but they did little to change the facts of the case. There was no doubt that she had killed Drew and Julian. The only question was whether she would be held accountable for her actions or whether she would be excused due to her emotional distress. In the end, the jury deliberated for days. The evidence against Eleanor was damning, but the question of her mental state weighed heavily on them. They knew she had suffered, but did that justify the violence? Could she be excused for her actions, or was this the cold-blooded act of a woman who had been driven by jealousy and revenge? When the verdict was finally delivered, Eleanor sat in her seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The room was silent as the foreman stood and read the decision. The words that followed struck her like a thunderclap. Guilty of manslaughter. It wasn't the verdict she had hoped for, but it wasn't the worst either. She had been spared a murder conviction, but the cost was still high. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. As the gavel came down, Eleanor's heart sank. The woman who had once been the darling of New York's art world, who had everything at her feet, was now a convicted felon. She would spend the next decade behind bars, her life forever changed by the choices she had made in the heat of betrayal. As she was led away in handcuffs, Eleanor's mind swirled with regret. The man she had loved was gone. Her life, once so bright with promise, was now in ruins. But in the depths of her despair, there was a small, flickering ember of clarity. She had been broken. But maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of her true journey, the one where she could rebuild from the ashes of her past. For now, all she could do was wait. Eleanor Lancaster sat alone in the stark, sterile prison cell that would now be her home for the next 10 years. The harsh white walls, the cold steel bars, and the muffled sounds of other inmates reminded her every moment that the life she had once known was gone. The life she had fought so hard to build, the life of elegance, art, and passion, had been torn apart by a single, irreversible decision. As she sat there, her hands resting in her lap, Eleanor couldn't help but reflect on everything that had brought her to this point. She thought about her childhood in Larchmont, growing up in the shadow of her parents' high expectations. She thought about the love she had once shared with Nate, and the way their marriage had faltered under the weight of their different desires. And then, of course, there was Drew, her second chance at love, or so she had believed. The affair, the betrayal, the rage, and the eventual violence, it all felt like a distant dream now. The fleeting moments of happiness, of contentment, seemed so insignificant compared to the painful reality she now faced. But what was most haunting to Eleanor wasn't the consequences of her actions, it was the feeling of being utterly lost. The woman who had once known exactly who she was, who had everything mapped out in front of her, now found herself questioning the very fabric of her identity. Who was she now? What had she become? Could she ever truly heal from the damage she had inflicted, both on herself and on the people she had loved? The prison walls offered no answers, only a constant reminder of her mistake. Every day, she was confronted with the enormity of the choices she had made. Yet, deep within her, Eleanor knew that the road ahead was one she would have to walk alone. Her future was uncertain, clouded by the weight of her past, but one thing was clear, she would never again be the same person who had walked into that courtroom. The betrayal had broken her, yes, but it had also shown her the harsh truth about herself, that no matter how much she tried to conform to others' expectations, she would always be searching for her own way, for her own voice. Time in prison was different from anything she had ever experienced. It was a strange kind of solitude, where the mind could wander endlessly, and yet the physical body remained constrained. But Eleanor began to realize that in this forced isolation, she had the chance to face the demons she had long ignored. She began to reflect more deeply on her actions, to understand the motivations that had driven her to this point. She had been a woman torn between her need for love and validation and her desire for control. But now, as she sat in the quiet darkness of her cell, Eleanor faced the possibility of truly discovering who she was without the expectations of anyone else, without the need for approval or the constant search for perfection. Months turned into years, and Eleanor began to rebuild, piece by piece, what had been broken. Her art, which she had once used as a means of pleasing others, became a form of self-therapy. She poured her emotions onto the canvas, allowing herself to process the pain, the guilt, and the anger that had consumed her for so long. Slowly, she found solace in her own creations, in the raw, honest work that no longer sought to impress anyone but herself. In time, Eleanor started to find a new kind of strength. She began to understand that true healing came from within, not from external validation or the pursuit of an idealized life, but from accepting her flaws, her mistakes, and her humanity. The woman who had once been afraid of imperfection, who had tried to mold herself into something she was not, now began to embrace the messy, complicated reality of her existence. She was a survivor. She was a woman who had fallen, but who had found the courage to rise again, in her own way. The road ahead was still long. Eleanor knew that her journey of redemption would never be easy, but she was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. She had paid the price for her mistakes, but she had also learned to forgive herself. And in that forgiveness, she found the freedom to move forward. As the years passed and the possibility of parole loomed, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder what her future would hold. Would she ever be able to find true love again? Would she ever regain the trust of the people she had hurt so deeply? Or would she spend the rest of her life haunted by the consequences of a momentary lapse in judgment? Only time would tell. But for now, Eleanor was content to focus on the present, on the art she created, on the quiet strength she was building, and on the possibility that, one day, she might be able to reclaim her life. What do you think about Eleanor's journey and the choices she made? Was her act of revenge justified by the pain she felt, or did she go too far? Can someone truly rebuild after such a devastating act, or is redemption out of reach? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your opinion on this complex and emotional story. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories that explore the dark side of human nature and the complexities of love, betrayal, and redemption. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.